Good evening, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and I've had a massive stack of books on my kitchen table for the last 8 days, waiting to do my wrap-up for Jane Austen July. So I've had a really productive day today, and I'm feeling like really energetic, so even though it's like 10 o'clock and that's normally bedtime for me, I'm going to go ahead and try and film a semi-coherent wrap-up of Jane Austen July. So I had a wonderful time for Jane Austen July, as I always do, but I think this month it was a very successful reading month for me. It was quite varied as well, and I read a lot of things that I enjoyed and things that I didn't enjoy but felt like I could criticise in an enjoyable way. I know that sounds weird, but I kind of got pleasure out of being able to see where maybe I would have done things differently. I'm thinking specifically of the Jane Austen, modern adaptations of Jane Austen, I suppose. So yes, I started the month off pretty well because I started by reading a book in one night, and it wasn't really a proper book, but it was called Pride and Prejudice, the sequel, and it's available on Wattpad, and it's by an author called Orange Cobra on that platform. I'm assuming they're not really called Orange Cobra in real life. And that was a story that imagined life for Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy after they'd been married for a little while, and it imagines a situation in which Lizzie can't have children, or Lizzie and Darcy, the pair of them between them, can't have children, and the kind of strain and pressure that puts onto their relationship. I liked that as a setup. I have to say I don't really remember the rest of what went on in the story because the rest of it was kind of a bit bad and quite forgettable. But the thing that I do remember is that Lizzie ended up, or the family ended up kind of adopting, oh yeah, I just remembered there was some really weird plotline where Bingley was kidnapped and they had to go find Wickham in a house somewhere. Very strange. But anyway, Lizzie ended up adopting Lydia's children, and I really liked that as a kind of little bit of a reference to, I guess, what happens in Mansfield Park. Oh dear. So Mansfield Park was the second book that I read this month. I read it as an audiobook. I really, really, really loved going back into Mansfield Park. This grows on me every single time. I am getting more and more confident in saying that it's probably my favourite Jane Austen book, which is weird because when I was first reading Jane Austen books, I read them as romances and I really didn't get along with Mansfield Park. And it is, to me, it's definitely the least romantic of all of Jane Austen's novels, and the love story element, although I can believe that they go on to have like a stable married life, which is difficult to believe of some of the other couples. I think they know how to live with one another and how to get along with one another in a way that you need to for a married life. The love story is a bit of a letdown, but I just love the characters and I love the people and I love the way that they get on with each other and just the interactions between them. It's fantastic. Anyway, I feel like I've talked about this previously this month a few times. I will say that my husband read it. I was very excited and pleased and proud to persuade him to listen to this as the audiobook, as we'd already got it, and he listens to a lot of audiobooks. I managed to kind of push it onto him gently. And he liked it better than he liked Persuasion, but he really didn't like Persuasion, much to my dismay. I think one of the issues maybe with Mansfield Park is that you kind of need to have an understanding of what social rules were like at that time and an appreciation of the fact that they don't change based on our modern sentiments, and we can kind of look back and say that's a silly practice, that's the silly way of behaving, but we have to recognise that for the characters in the books that's very, very real, and those are boundaries that they very much can't cross. And I think the less you know about the Regency world and Jane Austen's world, the harder it is to like go into the mind of Fanny Price and think these are things that I can't say, or these are steps that I can't take, and then you kind of think, oh, why is she acting like she is, or why is she not acting like she is? Yeah, so I don't know whether that was part of the factors. He does know the Regency world relatively well because we've watched a lot of film adaptations, and he also knows he's read Pride and Prejudice, but yeah, maybe it just wasn't quite enough. I don't know what your thoughts are with this one. It's definitely not one that I would have given to him as his first ever Jane Austen, but you know, we're a couple of books in now and he knows the plots of most of them, so yeah, it was worth a go. And like I say, he didn't hate it. We're doing all right. The next book that I finished was The Heiress by Molly Greeley. I read this on the Kindle and I didn't pull up the cover, so there's no point really me waving the Kindle around. So that is a retelling or an adaptation of it's set in the Pride and Prejudice world again, and this focuses on Anderberg. Is she Anderberg? Yes, she is. So Anderberg is obviously a character who Lizzie meets on her travels, daughter of Catherine de Bourgh, and she is presented in the books as very like weak and pathetic, and she is just kind of like I guess she's set up as like a counterpoint to Lizzie. She's like supposedly a rival to Lizzie, but Darcy doesn't care about her, so she doesn't really act in that way. It just kind of shows up the kind of ridiculousness of the Catherine de Bourgh setup. Yeah, I found this book interesting. It was written in a very slow and meandering way. It was like watching bits of dust floating through a shaft of light. I don't know whether I've read that somewhere, but that's definitely the phrase that sums up for me what reading this book was like, particularly the first part, because Anderberg is addicted to laudanum or opium for a large part of her childhood, and that's forced onto her to a certain extent by Catherine de Bourgh for motives, mostly I believe to control her daughter, and yeah, so with reading all of these adaptations, what I kind of don't get is that people can love Jane Austen so much that they will write the book, like write an adaptation, a version of it, and persevere with it and publish it and everything, but yet fail fundamentally to grasp what Jane Austen's characters are like. And I kind of felt like this almost wasn't a retelling of Jane Austen, because she almost seemed to avoid as much as possible using Jane Austen's own characters or using the scenes that Jane Austen offered her to develop this character in. Like, it would have been quite interesting to really see Elizabeth from Anderberg's perspective, but she kind of doesn't really use those scenes. It also had a very weird ending where she kind of seemed to feel like she had to do this really weird dreamlike sequence of telling us what happened like 60 years later or something when all the characters died, which I found odd. But I did quite like the... sorry, the pipes have just gone on upstairs and they're very much distracted my mind. I liked the love story that developed in it. I liked to see Anderberg have that chance to have a relationship, I suppose. I found it weird, with a couple of different adaptations, they quite often take the action to London, and that's something that Jane Austen generally avoids doing, and they particularly often take young girl characters to London. Same with the other Bennett sister, which I'm coming to in a minute. They take these young girls to London as a scene of like amazing, exciting exploration where they get to try out new things. And that's kind of the opposite of how Jane Austen sees London, and it's often portrayed as being this kind of like slightly dangerous, risky place where young girls fall into traps or find out that their lovers are deceivers. Thinking of one specific example there. So yeah, I find it weird that modern authors kind of interpret the situation differently, and they don't normally seem to fit in with the way that the world is set up when we're talking about Jane Austen's world. So yeah, I think that was everything. Oh, the only other thing that I wanted to say about the Heiress is that Anderberg has obviously been brought up with a very powerful addiction that's controlling a lot of her life, and a very domineering mother, and she just kind of gets over them. It just, like, halfway through the book, it just stops, and then she's totally done with her mother, and she's just like, oh yeah, you go live in another house, it's fine. And I don't think that was a very honest or accurate portrayal of what that level of abuse and control, because I would see that as abuse, what that would do to a person, and how they would respond to coming into contact with their abuser again after a very short time away from them. Like, I felt like there was a lot of introspection in this, but there should have been a little bit more about how her mother still hung over her, or the impact that would have going forward. So yes, that was that. The next book that I finished was Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. This was a contemporary of Jane Austen, and I have done a full review of it, so I'm not going to talk about it very much, but I did enjoy it. Then the next book that I read was also on the Kindle. It was The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. And yeah, a lot of the things I said about the Heiress also applied to The Other Bennett Sister. There were scenes that I felt like she could have made use of that she didn't, like scenes from Pride and Prejudice, where the sisters are interacting and Mary's there, but she just drops them for whatever reason. She skips from Mary's big moment, I guess, is at the ball at Netherfield, and then she just jumps from the ball at Netherfield until, she says 2 years later, but then acts as if at that point Lizzie's been married for years and years, when actually there's a long time between the ball at Netherfield and Lizzie getting married. I mean, nearly a year, as far as I can tell from the book. So I think she maybe hadn't quite worked out that timeline properly in her head, because things didn't quite have enough time to develop. I liked that we got to see some of the characters at later stages. So we got to see Charlotte Lucas quite a bit, turned her into a really ruthless and quite unpleasant character, which I didn't really think was justified from the book. And also got to spend some time with the Gardeners, and we all love the Gardeners. I thought they were relatively well portrayed. It then went on a very strange tangent where Mary turned into a completely different person. And yeah, it didn't really go, like, everyone seemed to love the other Bennett sisters so much. And I think that's because most of us are like quite quiet, bookish people who can really kind of relate to Mary to a certain extent. And we all kind of want to imagine that at some point we'll just come out of our shell and go to the Lake District and start understanding romantic poetry and stuff. But it just didn't seem to fit with how that character was in the story. There were some aspects of her development that I could follow, and some that it just didn't really work. And then she went from being this kind of really awkward plain girl who everyone overlooks to having multiple suitors for no real, like, it just didn't seem fair. If the premise of the story is that we're going to look at the life of the sister who is plain and overlooked, and then just suddenly make her into confident and the centre of attention, it didn't really fulfil the purpose of what it was supposed to do. It just turned her into kind of like another Lizzie. And it also, in the book, it makes Lizzie and Jane look very, very mean, which potentially they were. But that wasn't really the vibe that I got. Instead, we got this vibe from Mary where she's saying really quite uncaring things sometimes about Lydia, where she's talking about virtue. And I think potentially that comes from a perspective where she maybe doesn't really understand social norms, or she struggles with maybe fitting into a neurotypical context, shall we say. And that's an interpretation of Mary that I find works all right for me, to explain why she would say some really harsh things towards her sister. But I think Janice Hadlow just decided to gloss over all of that by cutting those scenes from the book. So anyway, that was the other Bennett sister. And then the next book that I read was another modern adaptation. I got into a little bit of a swing of it, and that was Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Dass. Again, I've done a full review of this one. I really enjoyed it. It's very basic and light-hearted, but yeah, it's enjoyable. So I would direct you to the review that I did rather than go on about it again here. The next book that I read, this is getting long, was Pride and Prejudice, but I decided to mix it up a little bit and I listened to it in Spanish. So it's Orgullo y Prejuicio, and it was narrated by Marta Cruz. I actually couldn't find who translated it, which is a bit bad, but in the Audible record that I had, it just doesn't seem to say, and on the cover it doesn't seem to say, so I'm afraid I can't explain that. Yeah, I loved it, and I was really like, I know this is not relevant to Jane Austen July, but I was quite proud of myself because it's been a long time since I did a lot of Spanish study and a lot of Spanish listening, and if I sometimes watch Spanish TV shows or films, but I always have subtitles, or even if the subtitles are in Spanish, I still have something to prompt me with, but I had no trouble following this, so I was pleased with that. It didn't change the fundamentals of the story as much as I thought it would. Like, I thought it would be quite a different experience listening to it in Spanish versus listening to it in English, but it just, like, I think because I know it so well, even though I was listening to it in Spanish, I generally heard it in English, and when there was a sentence that wasn't translated maybe the way that I would have translated it, or the way that I would have interpreted it, I don't know. Interpreted it. You listening know what I mean. I just can't work out how many syllables that's supposed to have right now. It stood out to me, and I would be thinking, that's not really how it was implied in the original, I suppose. But on the whole, it was a good translation, and yeah, I enjoyed it. It took me a little bit longer because I had to listen to it on like 1 speed as opposed to 1.5 speed, but I think that's probably fair enough. Then the next book that I finished was The School for Scandal by Sheridan, and I discussed that with my mum as part of our Discussing Drama series, and you can find that on her channel, so I will try and put links to all of these other videos that I'm mentioning in the description box below, you know, if I remember and if I can be bothered and all of those things. But, you know, there should be some links. Check back tomorrow if there's not one today. Yeah, that was enjoyable, and again, it was scene of action in London, same with Belinda, and yeah, same concept where young women in London, they're very much, they're not having the time of their life, they're very much at risk and caught in a network of scandal and gossip, which is what happens to Marianne when she's there in Sense and Sensibility. London is really presented fairly universally in Regency texts as being a place full of backstabbing, vindictive young women and naive young women who get caught in their snares. So yeah, modern authors taking their young characters to London, I always think, no, stay away from London. Anyway, so that was The School for Scandal. And the next book that I finished was poetry, and this was Selected Poems by William Cowper. I actually started reading this in the Kindle, but the formatting was really, really bad, so I just ordered it, and I'm very glad that I did, because this is probably my favourite poet that I've read so far this year, and I've been reading about, on average, a poetry book every month, and I've been quite pleased with that, like making progress reading more poetry than I have for a long time. I think Cowper appeals to me because it's very, very comprehensible. It's kind of like, I kind of feel a little bit like it's cheating poetry, because it's not like I came, for context, the poet that I was reading before Cowper was John Donne, and I would sit there and I would read it and I would read it again and I would read the notes and I would think, really though, what are you on about? Whereas with Cowper, you always know exactly what he's on about, and normally I didn't even need to read things twice, like I did for enjoyment, but I didn't feel like I couldn't follow what he was saying, which is nice. I can really see why Jane Austen liked him. I can definitely see why a character like Fanny Price would like him. The way that he puts things, his kind of religious and moral tones, they just kind of fit really well with those sentiments that we know those characters have. And yeah, it just interested me, the range that he had from comedic verse that's so funny that you really are laughing at it, to just utterly distraught verse where he's dealing with bereavement or some very difficult mental ill health, and he manages to capture that really, really well in his poetry, but also like political issues of the day. So extracts in The Task, it's not the whole of The Task in here, but it's got some extracts where he's talking about things like slavery, which is just, yeah, it was good to get that little bit more insight, I suppose, but also embedded in like a world of really stunning nature poetry about animals, and he was really keen on various pets. So yeah, that was fun. Then there were 3 books that I did not finish. In my Jane Austen at Home tag, I said that I was ready to dive into Ivanhoe, and I've got this little edition of Ivanhoe, and I did start it, and I got 48 pages in, and I didn't finish it, and I'm just like, I just opened it to page 49. I'm going to read a sentence at random, a full sentence. I'm not going to stop till I get to a full stop, and just give you a taster of why I kind of thought this is a little bit dense for me at the moment. This was a joyful intimation to Aymar, whose nerves were none of the strongest, and who had suffered such agitation and alarm in the course of passing through the dangerous bogs, that he had not yet had the curiosity to ask his guide a single question. Finding himself now at ease and near shelter, his curiosity began to awake, and he demanded of the guide who and what he was. It's just, that even wasn't a particularly bad sentence, but it's just intensely elaborate and very, very dense. And I like it, but at that time I was reading it while I was walking along, trying to like cram a bit of reading in, and I was like, I can't focus on the book and the traffic at the same time, and you know, when you're reading a book and walking at the same time, you need to be able to do both, so kind of sets the bar a little bit lower of the kind of books that you can read. I will return to this book and I will finish it one day, but I might set it myself at the beginning of Jane Austen July rather than trying to cram it in towards the end. Just while I'm on the topic of the Jane Austen at Home tag that I made, I didn't expect anyone to do it. I really didn't. I thought my mum would do it. I thought maybe 1 or 2 other people would do it. And I thought it would be really easy for me to catch up and see everyone's videos because there would be like 3 of them. surprisingly, quite a lot of people have done it. And I haven't been able to watch all of them yet, but eventually I will, and eventually I will comment on all of them. But I just wanted to say thank you for like picking it up and embracing it, because I don't think it was a very good tag, but it's really nice to see people doing something that, you know, like a tag that I made, and seeing all the different responses. It's been a very enjoyable experience. And then another book that I didn't finish was Jane Austen's Letters. It's not surprising that I didn't finish it, because you could really knock someone out with this. I think I read about 5 letters. My original plan was that I was going to read a letter every single day, but you know, I also have a life and a job, and it turns out that some of these letters are fairly long. And also some days I just didn't really want to or have the time to spare to even sit down for a short amount of time to read this, when I'd rather be reading one of the novels. I do want to read them all eventually, but I think this is like a long-term project where I'll read a few at a time. It's nice being able to, because the letters are kind of spaced apart. Some of them are like even a year apart from one another, or there's gaps of a year between clusters of letters that happened when Jane and Cassandra were separate from each other, because most of these letters are Jane to Cassandra. It's nice to get like a little snippet of Jane Austen's life every now and then, and not try and get too immersed and read the whole thing, because there's not the continuity really that rewards getting stuck in. So yeah, I think it works to save it for little bits and pieces. Then finally, another book that I didn't finish was this one, Critics on Jane Austen. I picked this up in a charity shop in, I think it was late May, when I was on a long walk with my mum. And I read maybe about a third of it. And it was really interesting to hear what different critics have had to say about Jane Austen over time, particularly ones nearer to her time period, I suppose, where people were actually reviewing her as a contemporary writer as opposed to somebody who's been revered for years and years, and how opinions have changed over time. But it didn't draw me in as much as, well, I mean, it's predictable that it didn't draw me in, because it's kind of quite stuffy essays, most of which I didn't really agree with, most of it which were written over 100 years ago. So yeah, maybe I shouldn't have expected to enjoy it very much. But I just thought it was so short that I'd be able to finish it, but I didn't. I will return to this next year though, because it's not linear, it's just different extracts through time. It doesn't feel like I failed to finish it, because I can just pick it up and start with the next essay next year, and I won't have missed any continuity. So that was all the books that I read. I just wanted to quickly say the things that I watched as well. So I watched Lost in Austen. That was pretty bad. I watched the Jane Austen book club. That was mediocre. I watched Becoming Jane. That was awful. Then I started on Mansfield Park adaptations. I've watched every possible adaptation of Mansfield Park, and I was going to do a tier ranking video of versions of Mansfield Park. Let me know if you want to see that in August, even though I didn't manage to do it in July, because I went to all that effort of watching a lot of Mansfield Park adaptations, and most of them are pretty bad. Just for the sake of doing this video that I never even got around to doing. The best one of them was From Mansfield with Love. The worst was not really a Mansfield Park adaptation, but it was called Metropolitan. Don't watch it. Please don't do it to yourself. It was recommended on the Jane Austen July discussion board on Goodreads, and I thought, oh, I'll give that a try. It was awful. Sorry to whoever recommended it, because I'm sure like people obviously really enjoyed it. Some people said that they liked it. I just really didn't, and I unfortunately forced my husband to sit through it as well, and I don't know how he didn't like tear our cushions apart by the end of it. It didn't ever really get any momentum going, and it's not an adaptation of Mansfield Park, so yeah, I don't know. It wasn't very great. Then I also watched we also watched the 2008 Sense and Sensibility, because it is one of our favourite Jane Austen adaptations, and it brings me joy every year to be able to revisit it and have 3 evenings of pleasure, because it's 3 episodes long, and it's really lovely. I meant to watch the 1996 adaptation for comparison, but every time I look at like the trailer for that or look at images for that, I just think it doesn't look right. 2008 is the only one that kind of looks right. So anyway, that was my very long, rambly and wordy wrap-up for Jane Austen July. I want to say thank you again for the wonderful hosts, which is Katie at Books and Things, Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, and Claudia at Spencer's Library, because they did a fantastic job this year. And I lost my bingo board by now, but I did check off every single item on the bingo board, and I did it by about 2 weeks in, so that was good. I like that as a little touch. At first I was like really religiously carrying it along and checking it every day, but then I realised I'd got them all easily, so I didn't need to do that. Anyway, thank you for watching and take care.